Okay, the next question is number 9. Now, number 9, I think it's a very worthy question to go over because it looks pretty ugly. You can see that there's a negative here, there's a negative here, but we need to do something first before we sort out the negatives. So the first thing that we must do first is to factor. And this is the time that you want to make sure that you draw parentheses, and you draw parentheses in a very strategic way. And that is, you do this. Okay, make sure you can see the relative sizes of the parentheses so that you can see which one's the inner layer, which one's the outer layer. Okay, so that now you can see that, okay, your graph has been shifted to the right for 2 units. So we have a point right here. Okay, now what about the negatives? Well, there are 2 negatives here. This cubic function. Sorry, it's cubic function. So a cubic function, if you cube a negative number, it remains a negative. So that's why these 2 negatives will actually cancel out each other. So now you are actually making this graph. So initially it looks pretty scary, right? But then if you actually simplify it, you can actually make it a pretty straightforward graph. So you can just go ahead and make a graph right now. Okay, right 1 up 1, and then right 1 up 7. And then on the other side, we do the same thing, and then we just go ahead and connect the dots. Okay, just go ahead and connect the dots. All right, now this question also asks that you have to draw the inverse. Now, this is another thing that challenged some students on the quiz. So some students, they were able to manage to flip the x, y values, like, okay, looking at this point maybe, you have 8 comma 4 right now. Okay, looking at this point maybe, this would be now 1 comma 3. Okay, 0 comma 2, and then this one right here, 1 comma negative 1 comma 1, and then the y-intercept would now be the x-intercept right here. So you can now, so the way you verify, and I've said this in class before, you've got to know what inverse is and what inverse is not. If you draw the inverse on the same pair of axes, you will recognize that it should be a reflected image over the y equals to x. Some students did not retain this piece of fact, and therefore they simply reflect the image over the y-axis, and they or reflect it over the x-axis, and somehow thought that it's going to be the inverse, which is not. Okay, number 1. Number 2 is that what's the inverse of a cubic function? It's a cube root function, so it should resemble the look of a cube root function, right? All right, so so now let's go ahead and write down the x and y intercepts, and they are a pretty nice looking graphs. So the x-intercept would be 2 comma 0. So the y-intercept for the inverse would be 0 comma 2. The y-intercept is 0 comma negative 7. So that's why the x-intercept for the inverse is negative 7 comma 0. All right, and the next thing is we need to find out the inverse algebraically. Okay, and for convenience, we are going to use the simplified version of the function to get it. Okay, so we have this, we switch to x and y, and then we cube root both sides to remove the cube, and then y is equal to cube root of x plus 2. We move the minus 2 over, that becomes a plus 2, and there we go. Okay, so there we have it. And then for f of g of x, okay, so we will consider this as our g of x, okay, as the inverse. And now in part C, I'm going to put a star next to part C, okay, because it's very important that you know the definition of inverse. A lot of people, they didn't know, so it is your responsibility to know the definition of inverse. And when we say f of g of x, f is this, okay? So we have this, And then we have to put down the g of x, which is this. Okay. So make sure you know what the notation means, and you must include the notation. Okay, and now we can simplify it. We have this, and we have x by itself, which is nice because if it's equal to x, that it's a good sign that it becomes it will be a hint that they are truly inverses of each other. And then we do a g of f of x. So now f of x will be placed inside the g of x. Okay, so you can see the color-coded notations. So now we have this, and the -2, plus 2, they cancel each other out. So equals to x again, which is lovely. So we want to have x because that's how they prove that they are inverse of each other. Okay, so that's the kind of questions you will be asked to do involving about inverses, finding inverses, plotting inverses, graphing inverses, providing proof of the inverses. Okay.